Do you know where your money is? It's a simple question. When you're running an organization and you need to make payroll and you need to achieve your funding somewhere and somehow, where do you start? Do you know where your money is the fundamental question of fundraising. You'd be surprised at how many people struggle with this question, including me when I started out working for the rescue mission. I was speaking in churches because it's all I knew how to do in terms of fundraising, and we had the opportunity because we had around 30 or 40 churches in Orange County, large ones, small ones, that were all supporting the mission, and they came from an array of denominations and independent churches. And we would speak, do a story about the mission, and my approach, and this was when I was a very new believer, and in the position of fundraising for this mission and speaking in churches when I really shouldn't have been, but there I was. And I had this thing figured out about how we were going to raise money for the mission. And that was, as we were down in the gutters with the homeless every day, and you're at your job, you're in your church, we'll be your arm to serve the poor. That was the message that I thought was the message I was supposed to say. So you don't have to get dirty, we'll get dirty. And at the time that the homeless situation had exploded here in the county at the end of the Vietnam War and the release of of folks from the mental institutions because they now had psychotropic drugs to take. All of that created the bag lady problem. All of it started in the mid-'70s. So I went out and I started speaking in churches. And the message I was giving them is, we're your arm to serve the poorest of the poor, and here's what we do. And I would ask them to take up an offering. So every time we spoke in a church, the church would take up a second offering. They'd either prepare the congregation for it or they wouldn't. It didn't matter, but that was my message, is we're here to help you serve the poor by being your arm to serve them. In addition, at the time, because of the explosion of homelessness in the mid-'70s, church secretaries all over this county were inundated with homeless people coming into their offices and making pitches to them about, that they needed some money for food, or they needed some money for housing, or they needed to go see their sick grandmother one last time. Whatever they could do, and they were on a circuit of begging, church to church to church. So I became very popular with church secretaries because I gave them little coupons and instructions that from petty cash they should keep a stack of $5 bills. And when a homeless person comes in, give them the coupon, call a taxi cab, give the cab the $5, and they'll bring them to the rescue mission and we'll take care of the rest. Problem solved. Church secretaries love me. And if you've ever tried to fundraise from a church, which is a mistake, by the way, that I learned, you know that you have to be able to talk to the pastor. And the church secretaries was the way in. They would always push my calls through because I was saving their job. And we were limping along with our fundraising. I hadn't developed an appreciation for small gifts or large gifts. I just would speak, and anybody that would come forward or that we could talk to, we'd emphasize that message. And then 2 Sundays in a row, something happened. And God took me out behind the woodshed, as Lewis Whitehead used to say. You know you're his son if he takes you out behind the woodshed. That phrase here means for a spanking. And I was taken out behind the woodshed by God by 2 small churches. 2 Sunday night services that I preached in, one after another the following week. And in both cases, the second offering was taken and not given to us. And I was infuriated. I couldn't believe that this pastor would deceive his own congregation to keep the money that we had raised. And God squared me away with the exact opposite inclination. He said to me, "Stop raping my church, my bride." Now, when I hear words like that, obviously that language came from within my own set of understandings, but that was essentially the message, was that I was the problem, not the church. And so I dug in and prayed. What I learned is that the money that the mission needed was hiding in plain sight. And I didn't know how to access it. So over the years, I developed this template called DAN. Discovery, Acquisition, and Nurture. They're the 3 tasks of fundraising, and we'll have okay. If you look at these 3 tasks, they each are interconnected completely, yet very separate things to do. For example, 1, discovery. That's the universe that you're in. We've been talking about this donor orbit, giver orbit. We're going to be using your giver orbit now to understand DAN, and that is to understand the 3 basic elements of fundraising. So discovery is knowing where to go and seek funds. Where's your money? Where is the money that God is setting aside for you? Who are you to speak to? Because what we're actually engaged here is the system that God set up for the support of his work. Remember, he chose us to carry forward his message for the last 2,000 years. I remember my pastor, John Wember, used to look out at the congregation every once in a while. We had a couple of thousand people in the room. This was at the beginning of the Vineyard Church. He'd look out at us and he'd say, "Folks, look around. This is it. It doesn't get better than this. You're it. You're who God chose to carry his message." When that sits in on you, it kind of freaks you out until you realize he's there with you, providing covering, and he is going to provide the resources. And so what you have to do now is go and encounter those resources. That's discovery. First, who am I going to fundraise from? Where am I going to fundraise? Those are the questions of discovery. And that is hard work all by itself, and we'll go into that in later sessions of how to approach discovery systematically. Second is acquisition. Once you've kind of acquired where you're going to raise your money, once you have an idea of where that is, then the job is to acquire that first gift. If you're in business, it's like acquiring your first sale. How good are you at communicating what the person you're seeking funds from is interested in? This is why we answer the 3 questions, why the purpose statement is so critical, because it is here where you draw the purpose of the individual and the purpose of the ministry together. That's what acquisition is. Third is nurture. So when you look at your donor orbit, your giver's orbit, remember the circles. The first circle was acquaintance, acquisition, acquaintance. So when someone gives you a first gift, generally they're just getting to know you, you're just getting to know them. That's this acquaintance level. And you want them to have a good experience with that. And what that means is that you don't just tell them happy stories, you tell them truthful stories of how their money is causing some kind of transformation in God's kingdom. That's what the whole purpose of knowing your purpose is about, why we ask those 3 questions, why we look at Dan, and why we're looking at acquisition very specifically. So that is specifically your fundraising, how you're doing it, either direct response, that is speaking, connecting, advertising, social media, whatever it is. This is where it is accomplished in acquisition. Next is nurture. Nurture is exactly what it sounds like. You're taking that first gift and you're helping that giver give to the fullness of what they are persuaded in their heart to give. If you've studied 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, when Paul spends a year out of his life taking up an offering, what was Paul doing during that year? He was preaching. He was preaching in churches, he was developing Christians, he was moving along, but he was also motivating the church to participate with him in this great offering back to the beleaguered believers, Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And he was raising the money from Gentiles. And he was nurturing them to the fullness of their giving. What are you persuaded in your heart to give? Read 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 for that, because that is the answer to one of the biggest heresies going around the world today since perhaps even Gnosticism, and that is this heresy of prosperity gospel. We're going to direct that head on several times during this course, because no matter where you're working, you're up against it. This idea that God can be manipulated, this idea that God wants you wealthy, that all you have to do is ask and you get, and if you don't get, it's because you didn't ask with faith. That kind of lie has been pushed so strongly that millions of Christians have been deceived by it, by these pastors who use fundraising to take care of themselves, to buy houses and beaches. Where 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now teaching this thing are television pastors in the United States living in $40 million homes. Where do they get that money? It was by ripping off small givers who are convinced that if they give this guy their money, the world's going to be evangelized and good things are going to happen. It's a pernicious lie. Satan knows how to lie. He's the father of lies. He's a beautiful creature. His lies come easy to us. And if they can move us 1 or 2% off of beam, that's all he needs to do, because then we might end up raising a lot of money. You can raise money with good ideas. You can raise money by lying. That's why we're all concerned, and why we're actually going through this course, is to learn how to persuade ourselves how God would have us raise money and honor those people that are around us. So we've got to separate good ideas from godly ideas. And godly ideas are one of service. And nurture is nothing but service and disciple making and communion of giving and receiving. This is where you work the communion of giving and receiving with your givers. This is it. Dan is the secret. And as we go through this, we're going to be coming back to this, back to the 3 questions, and back to the giver's orbit. So here I am sitting in my apartment, flummoxed over the fact that these 2 churches in a row had not given us their offering. And instead of focusing on the churches, God has me focus on me and my message. And I was gobsmacked in the head with the fact that I was using the church. I only saw the church as a pocketbook, as a wallet. It was the money. I went there to get it and take it home with me. And when I didn't have it, I felt it was the church's problem. And what God actually showed me was that I was taking from the church and not giving to the church. And that was a flip of 180 degrees that turned me around when it came to fundraising. I became so convinced that the church should not take up an offering. For one thing, it's practical not to ask churches for offerings. When you ask a church to take up an offering for you, and what you're actually doing is competing with all the other financial interests in that church, the leader of the Sunday school, the leader of the facilities, the person that wants to buy more band instruments, the needing to hire more youth staff because of a growing congregation. Those are all the things that churches fund for themselves, and then they fund mission. And when you're thinking about funding mission and going to a church for mission, you're asking them to act like they are a cash donor. Churches don't think like that. Never have, never will, even though they give out of their corporate giving. What they really do is encourage their congregation to give directly. Good question to ask a pastor is, in terms of when he fundraises for something, is where do your people get their vision for missions giving? My guess it would be from a child sponsorship organization, or from a missionary that they've met, or from an organization that they value because they were in college and they were mentored in the InterVarsity program. Any number of reasons. So, not just for the practical reasons that churches are all working to separate out their tithing pies into all the various functions, and along you come and say, hey, you guys have to do something about the poor on your streets. When I got it right, I started thinking about, what does this church need to know? And I literally started preaching out of Matthew 25 and the parables of the sheep and the goats. And did you bring me a cup of cold water when you gave a prisoner a cup of cold water? In fact, that was the one that struck me the most. I said there, you're giving me a cup of water when you give a criminal locked in prison for the safety of society a cup of water. So when I began to understand how Jesus identified with the least, the last, the most outcast, the lost in our society, that was our churches. That's our responsibility, to be that cup of cold water to the most despised, the most heinous, the person nobody wants around. And as I began preaching that message in the church, and stopped talking about the rescue mission and started talking about all of our collective responsibility, something improbable happened to me. And that was immediately our giving went up by 30% and then climbed from there. And what I did is I had a brochure that we used to pass out at every church where I spoke. I got a big red stamp because brochures were expensive. And I stamped it on the back of the brochure, and it said, do not give us the money you have planned to give to church. It was something like this. If you want to give to the rescue mission, please only give over and above your normal giving. And that was all I said on there. So I told churches, don't take an offering. I'm just going to, and so I started getting invited into more churches and into more venues because people wanted to hear about the homeless problem and that God had a solution for it and that they were the solution, that they could be a part of this. Because all of us that were living in this county at the time knew the homeless problem. We saw it. We saw the bag ladies, and we were desperate. We knew God wanted us to do something for these folks, that Jesus needed to be real to them, that their chance for a new life was to find their place with God and gain the Holy Spirit like all the rest of us had as counsel. Once the churches got that, what would start happening is when I'd speak, a percentage of the congregation, small percentage, 1 or 2%, would come forward and press cards on me or give me one of the brochures with their name written on it, or they'd hand me a check. All sorts of things happened. But I got to the point where I could tell a pastor that there was a group of people in his church, maybe 15, 20, or 30, that were deeply concerned about the homeless issue. And then we helped them build volunteer teams to go out and rebuild people's homes, the elderly, shut-in elderly. We built all sorts of different programs. We had thousands upon thousands of volunteer hours after this. And our funding climbed commensurate with our work because I learned to bless the church, not take from it.